somebody said, "Christ, we're hit." And there was a crash.
And he started pumping cannon shell at us.
Welcome to the Fighting High podcast, making their story our history. And thank you for joining me for episode 2 of our first series, Gazing into the Abyss, the Heroes of Bomber Command. In the run-up to the unveiling of the Bomber Command Memorial in London in 2012, and during the research for the respective book about the memorial, I had the privilege to interview Bomber Command Navigator Gordon Mellor. At the end of the often emotional interview, I asked Gordon what the memorial meant to him.
Yes, its main purpose is to recognise the input of the youth of that country in times of emergency. War was thrust upon them. They didn't have any say in it. The decision was taken by the cabinet, I suppose the royal family, politicians. Anyhow, it celebrates the youth of this country and of the our allies. Came from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and many other parts of the empire. It's the first time that it really has been recognised. At the end of the war, when peace came, then the armchair people came out and were quite derogatory about the effort of the of Bomber Command. The balance is being put right, but it also is a symbol not only of the casualties, which were very high, but all of us who took part.
In the maelstrom of the Second World War, a unique group of young men found themselves confronting the very edge of human experience. These were the airmen of Royal Air Force Bomber Command, many of whom were barely out of school, yet volunteered to fly explosive-laden bombers deep into enemy territory, night after night, with no guarantee of return. They were tasked with one of the most perilous roles in the Allied war effort, and although they rarely, if at all, call themselves heroes, their journey, both literal and emotional, echoes the great heroic archetypes of history and myth. This episode reflects on their journey, and we hear from the men themselves, their motivations, their training, their fear and terror, their loss, and their long fight for recognition in a world that was eager to forget them. A journey that follows the classic mythic hero story model of call to adventure, transformation, confrontation, and, if they survive, victory and return. In 1886, philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche stated, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." When thinking of Second World War aviators, popular imagination often conjures the steely resolve of film heroes in the Dambusters or 633 Squadron. But the reality, as uncovered through letters, interviews and recollections, was far more human. Most of the airmen didn't set out to be warriors of the sky. They were young men, even boys, seeking purpose, adventure, and sometimes simply a way to avoid repeating their father's experiences in the trenches of the First World War. Pilot Tony Iverson, in recalling how his father had been wounded on the Somme, remarked, "He bore a terrible battle scar on his chest." The stories of gas attacks and trench warfare haunted Tony's generation, and he was determined to find a different path. For Benny Goodman, it was the thrill of flight, recalling, "My father took me to see a display by Alan Cobham and his flying circus. I greatly admired these people tearing around in their flying machines, and this really triggered me off." Pilot Tiny Cooling remembered the early days of his training. "It was a beautiful sunny day, and I was diving down into these cumulus valleys, shrieking with delight. When I came back from this flight, I landed and was asked if I was all right. My response, 'It was bloody marvellous.'" Yes, They were conscious of what was going on in Europe, but these were not men primarily driven by hatred or vengeance. They were curious, idealistic and hopeful, and the Royal Air Force knew exactly how to appeal to them. Posters promised excitement, camaraderie, and a war-winning job for men of dash and initiative. The Air Force represented something new and modern. It wasn't marching in mud. It was flying above the clouds, riding the wind, and mastering machines that defied gravity. But not all Bomber Command airmen were British or from the Commonwealth. It became a truly multinational force, and for airmen whose countries were subject to Nazi occupation and oppression, such as the Poles and Czechs, retribution fueled their determination. Answering the call was only the beginning. Aircrew volunteers underwent months of training, often in far-flung corners of the Commonwealth, away from the threat of enemy attacks. Here they learned to fly, navigate, send Morse code, drop bombs. Yet this training was anything but safe. Over 8,000 aircrew died before ever reaching an operational squadron. Wireless operator John Bamfield was assigned as a pallbearer 3 times during his training, recalling, "The previous course got practically wiped out." Testament to the ever-present danger even before engaging the enemy. The abyss, to use Nietzsche's famous phrase, had already begun to gaze back. Towards the end of their training, men were crewed up, a surprisingly informal process. Bomb Aimer John Bell remembered how airmen were simply thrown together in a hangar, and here's John recalling what happened next.
They're all milling around, and you wonder who should I sign up? What happens next? Am I going to pick the right pilot? And what happened? I was standing with a Canadian navigator, looking a bit bemused, and someone came up to us. And it was obviously an air gunner from his brevet, and much older than we. And said, "Have you got a pilot?" No. Right. I said, "I found a pilot. I think he's all right." How he found out about his background, I don't know, but he was a great one for diddling out information. He said, "I've talked to him and he looks all right, so come and join us." So we went over and he said to the pilot, "I've got two more crew for you. I'll go and find a Wallace operator," which he did.
A glance at a brevet denoting the wearer's trade, a random nod, a handshake, and a few words were often all it took to forge the most important bond of their lives. These crews, usually of 7 men for the 4-engine bombers, would live, fly, and often die together. They trained together, trusted each other implicitly, and were welded into a fighting team through shared danger. What followed was an initial tour of 30 bombing operations over occupied Europe or Germany, 15 more if you were selected to join the Pathfinders. These ops were not symbolic acts. They were long, freezing, high-altitude flights into areas defended by flak, searchlights and night fighters. Every time they climbed into a Wellington, Lancaster, Halifax or Stirling, they knew the odds were against them. The danger was not abstract. It was vivid, visceral. Here's navigator Gordon Meller remembering a terrifying encounter with a Messerschmitt night fighter.
And he started pumping cannon shell at us, which caused some damage. And we had 2 other attacks from this fighter. He was no beginner. He knew what he was doing. And in the board engines on both sides were set on fire, and you could see the trace of whizzing past. And none of us in the front of the aircraft were hit. Neither was the mid-upper. So it was the poor rear gunner who took the packet. And yes, we were beginning to lose some power. Flames were in the wings and the inboard engines, and we were going down at quite a rate.
Rear gunner Dave Fellows recounts a mid-air collision.
Somebody said, "Christ, we're hit." And there was a crash of rending terror of metal and a thump. And some other aircraft had come out of the cloud just below us and stuck his port wing into us, right underneath the mid-upper turret. We went into a spin. Well, the skipper, after about 3,000 feet, got it out. And we dropped our bombs. He said, "I'm going to try to open the bomb doors if there's any hydraulics." We did open the bomb doors and we can drop our bombs safe. which we did. And then it was a stage of getting the airplane kind of sorted out. We were obviously going to turn around and try to get back home. So we started a slow climb to get up above the icing level to start with. The mid-upper gunner was helped out of his turret because there was no floor underneath him. The aircraft had disappeared from the bomb bay right back virtually to the main door. The trailing edge, starboard aileron, was all buckled. Over 3 feet of wingtip on the starboard side had gone. There was just a big jagged hole, no floor, just a big jagged hole in the aeroplane.
Australian navigator Cal Younger shares the exchange he had with his pilot Russ just after their Wellington had been hit.
I grabbed the pilot's chute and I just clipped it on one side and left him to do the other when I picked up my own parachute and put that on. Russ said to me, is there any chance? And I said no. And just then we went into a steep dive, and Russ, I could see, was resigned to, and he was sitting with a little smile on his face, and he said, "Jump, Cal," and I wasn't going to. Because I didn't think there was a chance, and B, I just felt an amazing sort of serenity, just as he looked serene himself, and I was happy to go down with him.
Cal and others in the crew would bail out while Russ fought to control the bomber. It cost Russ his life. Cal came to England from Australia as one of what he called 10 little navigators. Within a few months of starting ops, 8 were dead and 2 were prisoners of war. The dangers of ops weren't one-time ordeals. The airmen faced it repeatedly, some every other night. At one stage, operations counted for only a third of an op if the risk was deemed low, meaning some men had to fly far more than their tour of 30. Canadian Jack Fitzgerald wryly noted in a letter home, "If you go over there and get killed, you don't get only 1/3 killed." Jack lost his life over Denmark in August 1944. Perhaps the most psychologically jarring element was the rapid transition from life-threatening fear, perhaps even terror, to normalcy. One moment an airman would be witnessing another RAF bomber with 7 humans on board plummet to earth in flames. A few hours later, he'd be in the mess, eating eggs and bacon or flirting with a barmaid. This cycle repeated endlessly, and many crews developed a dark humour to cope. But no one came through it unscathed. The airmen lived on the edge, and many didn't live at all. Bomber Command suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any Allied unit. The post-war official statistics record 55,573 killed, 9,838 prisoners of war, and 8,403 wounded, a 60% casualty rate. What about the term heroes? Most veterans bristle at the word. We were just doing a job, they often say. But in a deeper sense, they fit the model perfectly. American mythologist Joseph Campbell described the hero's journey as a universal narrative pattern, a call to adventure, a journey into the unknown, the confrontation of supernatural forces, the winning of a decisive victory, and the return home bearing a gift to mankind. By this standard, Bomber Command aircrew were heroes in the truest sense. They answered the call, crossed into a realm of death and terror, faced inhuman challenges, helped defeat the evil of Nazism, and returned changed, bearing freedom, remembrance, and warning. Yet, these heroes were not treated as such. In the immediate post-war years, the British government distanced itself from Bomber Command, partly due to growing unease about the morality of area bombing. Winston Churchill, who once said, "The bombers alone provide the means of victory," neglected Bomber Command in his 1945 victory speech, and no specific campaign medal was issued. Their legacy was obscured by political discomfort and a shifting moral climate. Joseph Campbell identified a figure in the hero's journey known as the shapeshifter, someone who peers as an ally but transforms. In this context, Churchill became the shapeshifter, first their champion, later their forgetter. The public conversation about Bomber Command became obsessed with Dresden and the devastating raid of February 1945. The wider context across the entirety of the war, the extreme risk, the lack of precision weapons, the changing roles, the intent to shorten the conflict was often overlooked. Intentionality is the key concept. It is a moral mistake to equate Auschwitz, where the Nazi regime's intent was genocide, with Allied bombing aimed at liberation from the perpetrators and aggressors. Even those who survived and resumed normal lives found themselves haunted. Tiny Cooling, who once shrieked with delight during his first training flight, recalls living in post-war Frankfurt.
As I say, when you go and live amongst the people and work amongst the people and see their homes and see their cities and so forth and so on, you realise they're just the same as we are. But I tell you what, it does strike you from time to time. When we were living in Frankfurt, I was with Joan going through the town one day to be shopping, and coming towards us was a girl of our own age, in her 30s, on a crutch with one leg. And I don't know, but that hit, because she was a nice-looking woman, and yet she was crippled. Now, hell, she might have been in an accident. Equally, she could have been a victim of the bombing campaign. She was the right age. She could well have been maimed in a bombing thing. And I realised that there were lots of people in Germany like her who'd suffered because of the work in which I had been involved. And I just hated to feel that I might have been responsible for that. So morality does enter it, but it's one of those things you stuff in a drawer right at the bottom at the back. And it's only later, when you're clearing out your drawers, that you come across it. And it's inconvenient. You don't know what to do with it.
And that's what many veterans did, put their experiences in a drawer. They didn't talk about it, didn't dwell on it, but the drawer was always there waiting to be opened. For decades, the world was unsure how to remember them, but finally the tide began to turn. Authors, historians, families and veterans themselves fought for recognition. The Bomber Command Memorial in London's The Green Park was finally unveiled in 2012. It stands as a solemn tribute to those who served and died, a symbolic righting of historical neglect, a place of pilgrimage, and an opportunity to focus remembrance. People come from all over the world to pay their respects. At the unveiling, widow Jessie Bowler, who lost her husband Ernest Thurkettle in 1943, shot down over Denmark, stood quietly beside the memorial, clutching old wedding photos. Ernest's body remains in the wreckage of his Lancaster, his grave a hidden scar in the landscape. The Wall of Names at the International Bomber Command Centre, opened in 2018, commemorates by name the individuals who died in service with Bomber Command, a permanent and poignant reminder of the scale of sacrifice. So, were they heroes? By every narrative, moral and human standard, yes. They were not perfect, and they would never claim sainthood. But they took on an extraordinary burden, faced overwhelming odds, and gave everything they had to stop tyranny. They stared into the abyss, and sometimes the abyss stared back. Did they become monsters? Well, we don't know the detail of every former Bomber Command airman's personal life, but the ones I knew didn't appear to be. Instead, they became the quiet men, the fathers and then grandfathers with hidden medals, with memories of colleagues whose names were carved into silent headstones and memorials. Many veterans, I would suggest most, kept their experiences to themselves, and many was the family unaware of what Grandad did and what Grandad saw. Descendants of Bomber Command airmen often recall that Dad or Uncle or Grandad never spoke about their experience. Perhaps it was humility, or a way of shielding themselves from painful memories. Or maybe they felt that no listener could ever truly understand, that words would never be enough. Recent recognition, the opportunity to meet up with fellow veterans, and the pestering of inquisitive authors have, thankfully, encouraged some to open up. The airmen of Bomber Command were heroes of the sky and guardians of our freedom. We owe them more than remembrance. We owe them understanding. John Banfield, John Bell and Dave Fellows feature in the Bomber Command Memorial by Steve Darlow, Sean Feast, Robin Gibb, Jim Dooley and Gordon Rayner. Carlton Younger's story is told in his book No Flight from the Cage. Jack Fitzgerald's story is told by Steve Darlow in Bomber Command Failed to Return. Gordon Mellor's story is told in his autobiography ETA, a Bomber Command navigator shot down and on the run. All these books were published by Fighting High, and all the recordings were taken from interviews with Steve Darlow. Tony Iverson, Benny Goodman and Tiny Cooling feature in Five of the Many by Steve Darlow and published by Grub Street. Thanks for listening to the Fighting High podcast. You can follow Fighting High on X using @FightingHigh. Visit fightinghigh.com for details about books and blog posts, and follow the Fighting High publishing page on Facebook. If you'd like to keep up with my work, you can follow me, Steve Darlow, on X using @SteveDarlow.